Where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Tonight's story is about whispers buried beneath a village's brightest celebration, where tradition hides more than just memories. A young woman's search for truth awakens shadows long thought silent. It's a tale of secrets, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to face what we'd rather forget. Let's begin the story. Murder on the morning of May Day. The road into Milford Hollow wound gently between green hills and groves of budding apple trees, their blossoms stirred by the first soft winds of May. Jessica Fletcher, seated in the back of a modest town car, watched the landscape drift past with a sense of quiet nostalgia. It had been nearly 20 years since she'd last visited the village, just a brief stay at her late cousin's summer cottage on Willow Lane, but the memory of the place remained oddly vivid. The driver, a local teenager with more enthusiasm than precision, announced, "They're real excited to have you, Mrs. Fletcher. Miss Ashcroft's been talking about nothing else all week." Jessica smiled politely. "Well, I'm certainly honored. The May Queen ceremony sounds like quite the tradition." He nodded. "Biggest day of the year. People here treat it almost like a sacred rite." As they turned into the village proper, the signs of festivity became evident. The square was draped with bunting in faded pastel colors. Children dashed across the green, rehearsing their steps for the maypole dance. Elderly couples strolled past booths of homemade preserves and crocheted tablecloths. There was a quaint charm to it all, though Jessica noted that much of it seemed preserved more out of habit than joy. Dorothy Ashcroft was waiting near the gazebo, a slender woman in her late 60s with large spectacles and a strained expression. She waved Jessica over with a bouquet of violets clutched in her hand. "Jessica, you haven't aged a day," she said, pulling her into a firm but brief hug. Jessica returned the greeting warmly, though she couldn't help noticing the dark circles beneath Dorothy's eyes. "I'm so glad you could come," Dorothy said, leading her toward the square. "The committee insisted that someone of your literary stature crown this year's May Queen. It's symbolic." Jessica tilted her head. "Symbolic of what exactly?" Dorothy hesitated. "Oh, just rebirth, tradition, continuity. Things small towns cling to." Jessica glanced toward a group of townsfolk gathered around the maypole, their chatter bright but just a bit too careful. Something about it all struck her as brittle, like a painting touched up to hide a crack beneath the surface. Jessica's suitcase had barely been set in her guest room above the general store when she found herself pulled back into the heart of the festival's final preparations. Dorothy insisted on giving her a tour of the square, which had transformed into a tapestry of effort, hand-painted signs, floral garlands, and stalls offering everything from maple fudge to homemade candles. But it was the people, not the decorations, that held Jessica's attention. "Over there," Dorothy said, gesturing discreetly. "That's Ivy Creel. She chairs the May Day committee." Jessica followed her gaze to a sharply dressed woman in her 70s, her silver hair pulled into an exacting bun, her posture ramrod straight. Ivy was speaking to a group of teenage girls practicing their dance steps, correcting one with a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dorothy muttered, "Nothing happens in Milford Hollow unless Ivy permits it." Jessica raised a brow. "That sounds efficient." Dorothy's laugh was too quick. "Let's call it tradition." As they walked along the fringe of the square, Jessica paused near a makeshift stage where musicians were tuning their instruments. It was then she caught the sight of Ivy and Dorothy facing each other near the rose trellises. At first their posture seemed cordial, two women managing an event, but as Jessica quietly watched, she noticed Ivy's mouth tighten, Dorothy's hands clasping each other, Words were exchanged, quiet but pointed. Ivy's head shook once, her fingers tapping her clipboard. Then she turned briskly and walked away, leaving Dorothy rooted in place. Jessica approached gently. "Trouble with the schedule?" Dorothy started, then forced a smile. No, just logistics. Ivy worries about everything." Jessica murmured. "She seems passionate about detail." Dorothy offered a hollow laugh. "That's one way to put it." But Jessica saw something flicker in her eyes, wariness, and something more, not fear exactly, but the kind of tension that builds slowly, like steam in a kettle. It didn't quite fit the narrative of a small-town celebration, and for someone like Dorothy, whose life revolved around local archives and committee meetings, it seemed oddly out of place. Jessica said nothing further. She simply kept walking, filing the encounter away, not as evidence, not yet, but as the first tug on a thread that might unravel something deeper. Later that afternoon, as the village quieted with the heat of the day, Jessica slipped away for a walk alone. Dorothy had offered to join, but Jessica had insisted she needed a bit of air. Truthfully, she needed space to observe, to think. Milford Hollow had a charm that was easy to admire, but hard to trust. It was too still, too orderly. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, and where that knowledge could become both a comfort and a curse. She found herself wandering toward the war memorial in the southwest corner of the square. It was a modest stone obelisk, flanked by benches and a pair of weathered iron lampposts. Something about it drew her, perhaps the way it stood apart from the noise and color of the festival grounds, a quiet sentinel to older sorrows. As she approached, her eye caught something odd behind the base of the monument, a flash of pale color amid the grass. She stepped closer, crouched slightly, and gently pulled it free. A bouquet, not freshly laid. The mayflowers were dry at the edges, curling inward with age, but they hadn't been there long enough to disintegrate. They were bound with a ribbon, a narrow faded blue one, fraying at both ends. Jessica turned it over in her hands, gently. There was no card, no inscription, but someone had placed it here recently, deliberately. She sat on the bench beside the monument, the bouquet resting in her lap. Her fingers traced the ribbon's edge. The symbolism was unmistakable. Mayflowers, the bloom of spring, the heart of the festival itself. But left here, behind the monument, hidden from the pageantry, they spoke of memory, not celebration, perhaps even mourning. Her thoughts turned to Emily Ridley, the young May Queen-to-be, whom she had yet to properly meet, and to Ivy Creel's clipped conversation with Dorothy earlier, and Dorothy's eyes, how they'd flicked to Ivy's clipboard like it held the weight of something other than names and duties. Jessica looked again at the ribbon, noticing a tiny stain at the knot's center. Not blood, something darker, older. Ink, perhaps? Or sap? Either way, it suggested the flowers had been handled with emotion, not ceremony. She glanced across the square, where the maypoles stood tall and proud, already wrapped with color. The children had finished their practice. The booths were closing. The air carried the scent of peonies, and something faintly metallic, something unspoken hung in the stillness. Jessica stood and gently replaced the bouquet where she had found it, tucking it carefully behind the monument once more. She didn't want it discovered yet, not until she knew more, but as she walked away, she felt the first ripple of something beneath the calm. A story, perhaps, or a sorrow. And if there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that stories, especially the ones buried quietly, always find a way to be told. Jessica rose early, stirred not by alarm, but by the murmurs of distant voices drifting in through the window above Milford Hollow's general store. Outside, The air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of fresh bread and lilac. From her small room overlooking the square, she could see villagers already gathering, streamers fluttering from posts, and laughter floating above the chatter. She dressed quickly, fastening a modest string of pearls, then made her way down to the green. There was ceremony in the air, not the grand sort, but the kind only small towns can produce, one part nostalgia, one part pride, and another, harder to define. Jessica often found that pageantry had a peculiar way of revealing what people wished to be true. Dorothy was already near the maypole, issuing last-minute instructions to the young dancers. Left then right, not the other way round, she called, flapping her clipboard like a signal flag. Her tone, while cheerful, carried the unmistakable edge of someone bracing against more than logistical chaos. Jessica spotted Mayor Thomas Ridley near the bandstand, his bow tie askew, and his face drawn into a smile that didn't quite settle. His wife stood beside him, her expression composed, but her hands worked nervously at the clasp of her handbag. Between them stood Emily Ridley, tall, pale, and striking in her May Queen sash. The girl's auburn hair was crowned with early spring blooms, and she wore a dress so white it seemed to glow in the sun. Jessica watched her closely. Emily was smiling for the benefit of the town photographer, but her eyes drifted to the forest line beyond the green, lingering a moment too long. Jessica noticed the subtle shift, the shoulders that stiffened when Ivy Creel passed nearby, the hesitation in her step as Dorothy approached to confirm the crowning time. There was something expectant in Emily's bearing, but not the excitement one might associate with a teenager about to be paraded as local royalty. Jessica had seen similar expressions before, on witnesses about to testify, or women at memorial services who knew more than they had said. Still, the music began, and the villagers clapped. Jessica stood to one side of the maypole platform, crown in hand, rehearsing the ceremonial lines. But as the hour neared and the dance began, Emily was no longer standing where she had been. At first, no one noticed. The ribbons spun, the children danced, and the musicians struck up a charming, if slightly off-key, rendition of an old English reel. Jessica stood motionless beside Dorothy, still holding the crown of woven daisies and violets, its stems beginning to wilt in the sunlight. It wasn't until one of the girls dancing around the maypole whispered something to her partner and pointed toward the woods that Jessica felt the shift. A low murmur passed through the gathered crowd like a gust of cool wind. Then came the scream, sharp, high, and real, not theatrical, not playful. It cut through the music like glass against porcelain. All movement stopped. Jessica turned instinctively. A young woman in a green dress, one of the dancers, was running from the edge of the trees, her hands pressed against her face. Behind her came two boys and an older man in festival garb, their expressions ashen. The mayor was already moving, his wife a step behind him. Ivy Creel stood stock still. Jessica followed the crowd's movement, her heartbeat steady, but her thoughts racing. Something told her before she saw it, whatever had been waiting in those woods wasn't a lost dog or a fainting spell. The gathering thinned as the onlookers approached the small grove just beyond the square, where the path narrowed and the shade deepened. At the foot of an old birch tree, draped partially in shadow and partially in sunlight, lay the form of a young woman. Her white dress had caught on a branch, pulling upward at the hem. Her crown of flowers had tumbled to one side. Her sash, reading May Queen 2025, lay folded beside her. Emily, Jessica didn't speak. She knelt down quietly, observing first the position of the body, peaceful, almost posed. There were no visible injuries, but near Emily's right hand lay a small shattered vial. A faint scent lingered in the air, something bitter and herbal. Jessica leaned closer, noting the pale stain on the grass, the purple tint to the girl's fingertips. Just beneath her collar, nestled in the lace of the dress, was a petal oddly shaped, foreign to the bouquets she had seen that morning. Jessica reached for the sash. It was torn slightly at one corner, the thread frayed, and in Emily's hand she found something else, a piece of ribbon, frayed and blue, unmistakably similar to the one she had seen wrapped around the withered bouquet at the war monument the day before. Sheriff Calvin Murtaugh arrived moments later, his voice low and uncertain. "Looks like she fainted, or fell. Might be an accident." Jessica didn't respond. She stood, her hands folded gently before her. In her mind, the pieces had not yet formed a pattern, but the edges were beginning to show. The bitter tincture, the torn ribbon, the petal out of place. This had not been a fall, nor a fainting spell, and whatever had silenced Emily Ridley, it had not happened suddenly. Jessica remained by Emily's side, while the sheriff began marking a perimeter, asking the nearest townsfolk to step back. But even as Calvin Murtaugh pulled his notebook from his jacket, Jessica could sense the faltering in his voice, the visible weight of uncertainty behind his eyes. He was a capable man, she'd heard, but Milford Hollow didn't deal in death, not like this, not on May Day. Jessica crouched again beside the body, careful not to disturb the position. She had long ago learned that quiet observation often revealed more than frantic action. The broken vial beside Emily's hand glinted in the dappled light, its glass stained faintly green. A liquid trail curled toward a tuft of clover, its edges already drying. She lifted her gaze to Emily's fingers, lightly curled, the nails clean but tinged faintly violet. A curious color. Jessica had seen similar discoloration once during a tour at a botanical garden, when handling certain wildflowers with strong alkaloid properties. It was no common stain, not from soil or grass. And then, of course, there was the ribbon. It lay half-wrapped around Emily's fingers, barely noticeable if one hadn't known what to look for, but Jessica knew. It was the same worn blue as the ribbon she'd found tucked behind the war memorial the day before, frayed at the edges and faintly stiff, as though exposed to moisture long ago. She gently reached toward it, not to touch, but to see its knot. It wasn't tied in a bow, it had been looped, then ripped free, torn in haste, or in struggle. The sheriff cleared his throat nearby. "Doesn't seem to be foul play," he offered softly. "No signs of trauma. Could be a seizure. Maybe something she ate." Jessica straightened, not answering right away. Her eyes lingered on the small purple petal nestled along Emily's collarbone. Delicate, precise, out of place. She plucked it lightly and held it in her palm. It was not a flower from the maypole garlands. Not one Jessica had seen in the square that morning. If Emily had picked it up in the woods, it would be crushed or damp. But it was dry, pressed, preserved. Jessica said gently, "Sheriff, who last saw her before the ceremony." He blinked. "Well, her father, I suppose. Dorothy, maybe. Ivy was with the committee." Jessica nodded, though her mind was already moving past the answers. It wasn't just the presence of the petal or the scent of the vial that troubled her. It was the stillness in Emily's face, not peaceful, but resigned. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been accidental, and it hadn't begun in the woods. By early afternoon, the town square had emptied, save for a few volunteers dismantling the bunting with silent hands. The music had long since faded, replaced by the low murmur of confusion and the hollow ache of interrupted celebration. What should have been Milford Hollow's proudest day had slipped into uneasy silence. Jessica stood near the edge of the green, watching Dorothy speak softly with the Ridleys. Thomas had aged visibly in the span of an hour, his shoulders sagging under grief, or was it guilt? His wife stood beside him, her face composed, but her hand trembled slightly when she touched his arm. Jessica made note of it all, quietly, inwardly. Ivy Creel, notably, was nowhere in sight. Sheriff Murtaugh returned to Jessica's side with a weary glance. "We'll get the coroner in from Hartwood, should have answers by tomorrow." Jessica looked at him gently. "Do you really believe this was a seizure, Calvin?" He hesitated. "I'm not ruling anything out, but there's no immediate sign of violence. Could have been something she took by mistake." Jessica nodded faintly, though her mind was elsewhere. She had seen enough strange deaths, enough careful misdirection to recognize a pattern beginning to form, not yet complete, but taking shape. Her gaze drifted to the maypole still standing at the center of the green, its ribbons fluttering now in solemn quiet. One stream of blue fabric twisted in the breeze, catching the light. Jessica folded her arms and said more to herself than to the sheriff. "There's something in this town that hasn't healed, something that didn't begin today." Calvin frowned slightly. "Are you saying you think this was intentional?" "I'm saying I don't think it was sudden." She turned toward the inn. She would stay, not because anyone asked, but because someone needed to listen closely. And Jessica Fletcher had always been good at listening when the rest of the world was busy looking away. Jessica sat alone in the back parlor of the inn, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The scent of bergamot drifted upward, though she had long since ceased tasting it. Her mind remained fixed on the blue ribbon, the broken vial, the unnatural petal. They hovered in her memory like fragments of a sentence left unfinished. She glanced out the window toward the square, where volunteers had begun dismantling the maypole. It looked almost like a relic now, its festive colors oddly garish in the quiet aftermath. Jessica found herself drawn, again and again, to the old bouquet behind the war monument. Someone had left it there to remember, or to warn. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock of Dorothy Ashcroft. "I hope I'm not intruding," Dorothy said gently, stepping inside. Jessica offered a seat with a warm, if subdued, smile. "Not at all. You've been very kind to me." Dorothy sat across from her and folded her hands, though her eyes did not meet Jessica's at first. "There's something I think you should know about Emily." Jessica inclined her head, encouraging. She'd been asking questions, Dorothy began, about the festival's history. Old May Queen's. It wasn't just for her speech. She came to the Historical Society twice last month, asking for records. She even brought me an old journal, her grandmother's, I think, but she wouldn't say much, only that she thought something had been hidden. Jessica leaned forward slightly. Hidden by whom? Dorothy hesitated. She didn't say, but she was fixated on 1975. That year's May Queen was a friend of mine, Sarah Ames. Jessica felt her interest sharpen. "The name sounds familiar." "She disappeared," Dorothy said quietly. "Well, that's what we told people. She left town before the crowning. Vanished. There were rumors. Some said she ran off with a boy from a neighboring town. Others whispered that she was pregnant, or had a breakdown. The truth is, we never really knew." Jessica watched Dorothy closely. "And you believe Emily was looking into Sarah's disappearance?" "I know she was. She told me Sarah might be connected to her family. She had this idea that the past hadn't been buried properly." Dorothy's voice faltered. "She asked me to keep it quiet. Said it was personal." Jessica considered that carefully. "Did she ever mention Ivy Creel?" Dorothy's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Ivy doesn't like questions about the past. She prefers her version of the festival, the tidy, respectable one. Jessica gave a small nod. Sometimes history isn't quiet because it was peaceful. Sometimes it's quiet because someone muffled it. Dorothy let out a soft sigh. Emily was persistent, but also frightened. I didn't see it then. I thought she was indulging a mystery. But now, Jessica reached out, placing her hand gently over Dorothy's. It may not be too late to listen to what she was trying to say, and in her heart, Jessica already suspected that someone had heard Emily's questions and silenced them. The Ames property sat just beyond the bend of Mill Lane, where the stone walls gave way to meadows tangled with wild buttercups. Jessica had phoned ahead, though it was more courtesy than necessity. In small towns, word traveled fast, and the appearance of Jessica Fletcher at one's door was rarely a surprise. Mr. Walter Ames opened the screen door with a slowness that spoke less of frailty and more of reluctance. He was in his late 80s, sharp-eyed despite his stooped frame. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice like dry leaves. "You've come about Sarah." Jessica inclined her head. "May I come in?" The parlor was dim, cluttered with books, and smelled faintly of wood polish and chamomile. On the mantel sat a photograph, a teenage girl in a white dress, smiling nervously beneath a crown of daisies. "Sarah," he said, following her gaze. She was 17 that spring, chosen May Queen and gone before the dance. Jessica took a seat by the window. "Did you ever hear from her after she left?" "No letters, no calls, nothing," he said. "Folks said she ran off, that she was soft, weak. But Sarah wasn't weak. She was scared of something, though. Something close." Jessica studied him. "You don't believe she left of her own accord?" Mr. Ames's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his tea. "I stopped believing that a long time ago." Jessica hesitated before asking, was there anyone in particular she confided in, someone she may have feared? He looked at her for a long moment. There were people in town who didn't like the way Sarah challenged things. She spoke up. She asked questions. Ivy Creel thought she was disrespectful, called her a disruption. Jessica nodded slowly. "Did she have any connection to the Ridley family?" A flicker crossed his face. "You'd have to ask them. All I can tell you is this. Sarah didn't just vanish, and no one wanted to ask why." Jessica stood and approached the photograph. A pressed flower, now brittle with age, had been slipped behind the glass. It looked strikingly similar to the one found on Emily. As she left the house, Jessica felt it settle deeper. This was no coincidence. Two young women, decades apart, both drawn toward the same shadowed story. And someone, still alive, had much to lose if the truth ever bloomed. Jessica's path took her back toward the town square, now oddly hushed in the late afternoon light. Festival remnants lingered like ghosts, ribbons stirring on fences, half-dismantled booths, garlands gone dry at their edges. But Jessica's attention was elsewhere. She found Ivy Creel near the church steps, directing a trio of volunteers folding chairs. Her voice was crisp, her posture exacting, but Jessica noted the subtle tightness in her mouth, the forced efficiency in her tone. "Ivy," Jessica said gently as she approached, "could I borrow a moment?" Ivy turned, her smile practiced. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher. I imagine you have questions." "Everyone seems to." "I'd like to ask about Emily," Jessica said. "Dorothy mentioned she was doing some research into past May Day celebrations. I'm told she was particularly interested in 1975. Ivy's expression didn't shift so much as solidify. "That was a long time ago, and I can't imagine what relevance it has now. I understand Sarah Ames was selected as May Queen that year, and that she disappeared before the crowning." Ivy folded her arms. Sarah was troubled, impulsive. She embarrassed the committee by vanishing, and her family by abandoning her responsibilities. But that was decades ago, and frankly I'm not sure why Emily or anyone would go digging around in it. Jessica nodded slowly. "So you believe Emily was simply indulging a curiosity? She was a bright girl, but sometimes bright girls imagine mysteries where none exist." Ivy's voice carried a note of sharpness now, like the clink of porcelain cracking. "Milford Hollow has built this festival on pride and tradition, not on scandals or ghosts." Jessica didn't respond right away. She looked instead toward the bandstand, quiet now in the slanting sun. "But tradition and truth aren't always the same thing, are they?" Ivy's lips pressed together. "If you'll excuse me, I have a great deal to do." As she walked away, Jessica noted how Ivy's pace quickened, how her hands gripped her clipboard just a touch too tightly. It was not the discomfort of sorrow, it was the discomfort of memory. Jessica watched her disappear inside the church hall, and thought, not for the first time, that silence is rarely neutral. It often has a purpose, and sometimes it has a price. That evening, Jessica returned to the Ridley home under the pretense of offering condolences. The mayor's wife, pale but composed, welcomed her with tight civility. Jessica was shown into Emily's room, at her own request, and left alone for a few minutes to pay her respects. The room was modest, neat, its furnishings typical of a girl on the brink of adulthood, part childhood remnants, part emerging independence. On the writing desk, Jessica found a notepad, the top page blank but faintly indented. She reached for the pencil beside it, and gently shaded over the surface. The words appeared gradually, like a whisper resurfacing. "I found the ribbon." The truth was buried with her. Jessica's breath caught. It wasn't just a reference to Sarah. It was confirmation that Emily had found something tangible. The ribbon, possibly the very one clutched in her hand at the time of her death. And buried, a word too deliberate to be poetic. She turned to the bookshelf. Tucked between two slim volumes of poetry was a pressed sprig of mayflower, brittle now, but carefully preserved. Its stem was wrapped in a sliver of faded fabric. Jessica ran her finger over it, remembering the bouquet behind the monument, the petal by Emily's collar. Emily had been connecting threads, quietly, carefully, and someone had noticed. There was no diary, no journal, nothing else remained. Jessica knew better than to believe that meant it hadn't existed. She looked once more around the room. The lamp on the nightstand had a cracked base. The curtains bore faint reddish staining at the hem, mud, or something else. All small details, perhaps, but often it was the smallest things that shifted the narrative. Emily had been trying to tell a story. She hadn't lived long enough to finish it. The next morning, Jessica met Daniel Kerr on the schoolhouse steps. He was Emily's literature teacher, a young man with an unpolished kindness and the air of someone still figuring out where he fit in the world. His eyes, when he looked at her, held grief unfiltered by formality. "I wanted to speak with you," Jessica said. Not as a stranger, but as someone who's listened closely to the questions Emily was asking. Daniel's mouth tightened. "You think her death wasn't an accident?" Jessica didn't answer directly. "I think she was afraid, but not of the woods." Daniel looked away. "She thought someone was hiding something from her. She told me once that Milford Hollow only looks peaceful if you don't look too far back." Jessica waited. "She believed Sarah Ames was her grandmother," he said at last. "She told me she'd done the math birth records, timelines." She said there were inconsistencies in her own family's stories, especially from her father's side, that her mother never talked about the Ridley history before the mid-1970s. Jessica felt a slow, thoughtful stillness settle over her. Daniel continued, his voice growing quieter. She found an old envelope in the attic, addressed to someone named Wusu Ames with a photograph inside. It was of Sarah, holding a newborn. Emily said the baby's birth date matched her own mother's. So if that was true, Jessica began. Then Sarah didn't disappear. She died. And someone covered it up. Jessica was silent for a long moment. Did she show you the envelope? No. She said she was going to, but then she got careful. She said people were starting to watch her too closely. Jessica's thoughts returned to Ivy, to the blue ribbon, to the missing records Dorothy had hinted at but never seen. And you believe her? Daniel met her eyes. I loved her. I believed everything she said. Jessica nodded. She believed it too, perhaps not all of it, not yet, but enough to follow the threads further, and she sensed that whatever Emily had found, it had touched nerves still raw beneath the town's polished surface. As Jessica walked back toward the heart of Milford Hollow, her mind moved slowly, carefully, stitching together what she'd been shown and what she had only sensed. Emily had uncovered a connection between herself and Sarah Ames, a thread that, if true, implicated not just history, but legacy. If Sarah had died in 1975, and her child had been raised under a different name, then Emily was not just curious, she was kin. The past hadn't simply intrigued her, it had belonged to her, and someone had wanted her to stop asking questions. Jessica's steps brought her to the steps of Town Hall. Inside, the mayor's office door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the low cadence of Thomas Ridley's voice. She paused, not to eavesdrop, but to consider. Thomas had been unusually controlled since Emily's death, his grief muted, precise. She knew that kind of silence. It wasn't always mourning. Sometimes it was fear. She knocked lightly. Thomas looked up from his desk. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, standing. "Please, I've been meaning to speak with you." Jessica entered quietly. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. Photographs of past festivals lined the back wall, each May Queen smiling in youth and bloom. "You knew Sarah Ames, didn't you?" Jessica asked gently. Thomas hesitated. "Yes, everyone did. You were both in the 1975 festival. She disappeared shortly before the crowning. And now, nearly 50 years later, your daughter is found dead with a ribbon in her hand, one that closely matches a bouquet left in her memory." Thomas's jaw tensed. "You think the two are connected?" "I think Emily believed they were." He lowered himself back into his chair, his shoulders heavy. Sarah was a bright girl, strong-willed. She didn't like being told what to do, especially by Ivy. There were tensions. Jessica sat across from him. What kind? She didn't want the crown, said the whole tradition felt like theater. She accused the committee of ignoring real concerns in the town. He paused, then added, "That last week we argued, about the festival, about other things." "Things?" Jessica asked softly. "She told me she was in trouble, that she needed help. I didn't know what to do." His voice faltered. And then she was gone. Jessica absorbed this in silence. Thomas wasn't lying, but he was choosing carefully which truths to tell. As she left the office, she glanced again at the framed photos. One from 1975 showed Thomas as a young man, standing behind Sarah in her ceremonial dress. His hand rested near her shoulder. The photo was slightly out of focus, but the expression on Sarah's face was not. She wasn't smiling. Jessica arrived at the Milford Hollow Library just before closing. The librarian, Mrs. Elvira Hodge, was putting away a stack of local history volumes when she spotted Jessica by the microfilm reader. "My goodness," Elvira said, adjusting her glasses. "Haven't had anyone touch that machine in years." Jessica smiled. "I've always had a fondness for towns that keep their histories close at hand." Elvira's mouth curved into something wry. "Here, history doesn't stay close, it stays hidden." Jessica looked up. "Could I ask about the May Day records from 1975? Elvira hesitated. "You and everyone else lately." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Emily Ridley? She came by twice, polite as can be but determined. Asked for committee logs, photographs, expense ledgers. I gave her what I could." "And what couldn't you give her?" Elvira reached behind the counter and retrieved a sealed file folder, labeled in careful handwriting Festival Records 1970-1979. She opened it slowly. "Pages missing," she said. 3 to be exact. Meeting minutes, budget authorizations, and a letter Sarah Ames supposedly wrote to Ivy Creel. Jessica studied the empty space between the clips. "Removed recently." "Very," Elvira said. "And not by accident. The bindings were sliced with a scalpel or razor. No tearing, no damage to the rest of the file." "Who had access?" Elvira gave a thin smile. "Well, I'm not accusing anyone outright, but Ivy's been chairwoman of the May Day Committee since '73. She doesn't like people stirring old sediment." Jessica tapped her fingers lightly on the table. "Did Emily ever find out those records were missing?" "I told her." She didn't seem surprised. That struck Jessica. Emily had expected obstruction, which meant she already knew there were things people would rather stay hidden. As Jessica thanked Elvira and stepped out into the cool twilight, she felt the silence of the village pressing in once more. But it was no longer the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of things buried deliberately. And somewhere behind that silence, she now suspected, was the final week of Sarah Ames's life. Jessica had just returned to the inn, her thoughts heavy with Elvira's words, when the telephone behind the front desk rang. The innkeeper answered and immediately glanced toward her. "It's the sheriff," he said, holding the receiver toward her. "Says you might want to hear this." Jessica took the call. Sheriff Murtaugh's voice was steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "We've taken Daniel Kerr into custody." Jessica's grip tightened slightly. "On what grounds?" Search of his cottage turned up a crushed bouquet of mayflowers, a second broken vial, and a petal similar to the one found on Emily's dress. All of it was stashed in his closet. "And there's a journal entry in Emily's handwriting. Mentions meeting Daniel near the woods the morning she died." Jessica closed her eyes. "That doesn't sound like the Daniel I met." "Well, people have sides," he said. "Even to you." She hung up gently, the unease spreading. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, Daniel was already behind the partition, seated with hands folded. He looked less frightened than betrayed. "I didn't kill her," he said softly, as she approached. "I loved her. She was everything bright in this place." Jessica didn't respond with platitudes. Instead she asked, "Did you keep dried mayflowers in your home?" "No, Emily gave me a few once, pressed between a book of poems, but I never." "And the vial?" He shook his head. "I don't know what that is. The sheriff found it in a shoebox I haven't opened in months." Jessica believed him, not because he seemed sincere, many people seemed sincere, but because the evidence was too neat, too timely. The bouquet, the petal, the journal, perfectly incriminating, but strangely staged. Someone had known what the sheriff would look for, and someone had known precisely where to plant it. As she left the station, Jessica's thoughts narrowed. Framing Daniel wouldn't just deflect attention, it would send a message to anyone still poking around old secrets. She needed to be careful. Whoever had silenced Emily wasn't merely hiding the past. They were manipulating the present. That evening, Jessica sat at Dorothy's kitchen table, sipping weak chamomile tea. The air inside the house was stuffy with unopened windows and the faint smell of dried lavender. Dorothy had become quieter over the past day, as if something inside her had folded in. Jessica approached carefully. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I ask only because I believe Emily trusted you." Dorothy looked up, startled. "Of course. I was reviewing public records from the town's budget. Just a habit of mine when timelines don't add up. There was a recent transfer from Mayor Ridley's discretionary fund to the Historical Society, a significant one, and it happened only a few days before Emily died." Dorothy's spoon clinked gently against her cup. Jessica continued, softly, "Was that payment for something or someone?" Dorothy's composure didn't crack, but her eyes dropped. "I didn't ask for it," she said after a pause. "Thomas insisted." Jessica waited. "I told Emily I'd help her access records from the archives, off the books. Some things aren't in the public system. She was convinced there was proof somewhere. She gave me a list, and I did what I could. When Thomas found out, he said it was for my protection, that if anything got out, I could be seen as complicit." Jessica let that settle. The mayor had essentially paid to make Dorothy's cooperation seem like loyalty. Did Emily know about the payment? "No," Dorothy whispered. "She thought I was helping her because I believed her." "And did you?" Dorothy looked away. "I wanted to." Jessica rose slowly, her tone gentle. "Then you must help her now." Dorothy nodded, but the weight of what she hadn't said lingered in the air between them. Jessica knew the money had bought more than silence. It had bought time, and time, in a mystery like this, was always running out. The next morning was overcast, and Dorothy arrived at the inn without calling ahead. She wore a cardigan despite the warmth, and carried a worn envelope tucked under one arm. Jessica met her in the reading room, where the fire had not yet been lit. "I couldn't sleep," Dorothy said, taking a seat beside the tall bookshelf. "I kept hearing her voice, Emily, asking me not to stop." Jessica listened without speaking. "I did find something," Dorothy said. "After Emily's last visit, she'd left it tucked in one of the town registers, probably by mistake. I didn't know what to do with it." She handed over the envelope. Inside were two items: a small photograph, faded, curling at the edges, of Sarah Ames standing beside a man in front of the Ames house, her belly slightly swollen. She wore no crown, only a simple summer dress. The second item was a letter, incomplete and written in Sarah's neat cursive. "To the child I may never hold, know that your life is not a mistake. You are loved. You are the bloom that came too early, the truth I was not allowed to speak." Jessica read the rest in silence. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink growing faint as though Sarah had stopped, interrupted perhaps, or afraid to continue. Dorothy's voice shook now. Emily thought this letter proved Sarah never left town, that she died here. She was going to confront someone. "I told her to be cautious. I didn't think she was in danger. I thought it was just politics." Jessica placed the letter on her lap and looked at Dorothy gently. "You believed her?" Dorothy nodded. "But I wasn't brave enough to say so." Jessica said nothing for a long time. "Then we can still speak for her, Dorothy. But we have to be willing to name the truth." Dorothy lowered her gaze. "I think I know who she confronted, but I don't know what happened next." Jessica folded the letter carefully. Her thoughts now turned, inevitably, toward the final piece. The person who had everything to gain by silencing both women, one in 1975, the other now. The past had cast a long shadow, and Jessica was nearly standing in its center. Jessica sat alone in the reading room after Dorothy left, the envelope resting in her lap like an unopened verdict. The air felt heavy with the scent of old paper and fading roses. Outside, Milford Hollow seemed unchanged, still polite, sun-drenched in that early summer way, but inside her something had shifted. She thought again of Sarah Ames's unfinished letter, the soft curve of her handwriting, and the weight behind her silence. It reminded Jessica of a fragment of verse she had once seen
years ago in a local anthology from the region.
Sarah had been known to write poetry, fragile, personal, the kind young women composed when no one was looking. Jessica rose and crossed to her small satchel. She carried with her a notebook, filled with impressions, dates, and the occasional line she couldn't forget. From the middle of a page she'd scribbled weeks ago, a single sentence stood out now like a voice long muted. The flower that blooms too early hides a truth too deep to show. It had struck her as curious at the time. Now it felt like an echo, a private riddle. Her mind returned to the strange dried petal she'd found at Emily's collar, the delicate purple shade, not native to the Hollow's curated gardens or the festival bouquets, and to the crushed blossoms found in Daniel's home, too conveniently placed, all pointing, perhaps, not to something ordinary, but something rare, something out of place. What kind of flower left that kind of stain, that kind of warning? She rose slowly, her fingers still curled around the memory of Sarah's words. The ribbon, the vial, the petal. It wasn't just a message, it was a path. And Jessica, now certain of where that path began, knew it led back to where everything had first been buried, not just in secrecy, but in soil. The Ames estate, forgotten by most, untouched by time. And if Sarah's poetry held truth, still growing what no one wished to remember, the gate at the edge of the old Ames property hung askew, rust flecking the hinges like dried blood. Jessica pushed it open with effort, the groan of metal the only protest. The path had nearly vanished, swallowed by creeping vines and low brush, but her steps were steady. The house itself stood quiet, its windows blank with age. Curtains still hung behind the cracked glass, a lace of cobwebs and dust, but it was not the house she had come for. She made her way around back, where the trees thinned into a sloping rise. The scent here was different, moss, bark, something earthy and almost sweet, wild mint, and beneath it, the faint trace of something darker. And then she saw them. Tucked along the fence line, sheltered beneath a cluster of yew and elm, bloomed a scattering of slender purple flowers, star-shaped petals, vibrant even in the filtered light. They grew in small clusters, half forgotten, but thriving. Jessica knelt carefully, brushing aside the undergrowth. The stems were fine and silvery, the leaves narrow and pointed. She plucked a single bloom and turned it gently between her fingers. It was the same, exactly the same, as the petal found on Emily's dress. A flower that didn't belong to the festival or to the square. A flower that only grew here. She remembered something else then, a phrase from a botany lecture long ago. Jacob's Bain, rare, mildly toxic, harmless to touch, but dangerous when distilled improperly. Had Emily come here? Had she followed the clues perhaps left by Sarah's forgotten letter or journal, and found this garden? And had someone followed her? Jessica stood, the flower still in hand. Her gaze drifted toward the base of the maypole, just visible from the hilltop. If Emily had uncovered where Sarah's story ended, perhaps she had also uncovered where it was hidden, beneath celebration, beneath tradition, beneath the ground itself. Jessica stood for a long moment at the back of the Ames property, letting the petals fall gently from her hand onto the soil. The soft rustle of distant leaves was the only sound that accompanied her walk down the hill, back toward the village green. The maypole still stood, though the ribbons now drooped in the heat. Children no longer danced beneath it. The music had long faded, but something about the pole itself pulled her, tall and central. It had been rebuilt and repainted so many times that no one likely questioned what lay beneath its ceremonial roots. But Jessica had begun to. She followed her thoughts carefully. The petal on Emily's dress, the same flower that bloomed only in Sarah's abandoned garden, the mention in the letter, the bloom that came too early, the broken ribbon, the secrecy. All of it pointed to a place that had both symbolic and physical weight. And then she remembered what Dorothy had told her, almost offhandedly, about a former landscape expense recorded in the 1975 festival budget, vague language, no details, and approved with unusual haste. She made her way to the base of the maypole and knelt near the earth, pressing her hand gently against the packed soil. There was a slight give. Something disturbed here, not recently, but not untouched either. Later that afternoon, with reluctant permission from the sheriff and quiet support from Dorothy, a small section of the earth beneath the maypole was carefully excavated. The onlookers, few, somber, uncertain, stood at a respectful distance. It didn't take long. Beneath just a few inches of soil lay a rusted tin box, its edges corroded with time. Jessica herself lifted it free, her hands steady, though her breath caught faintly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several items: a faded photograph of Sarah Ames holding an infant swaddled in a white shawl, a narrow strip of embroidered fabric, possibly part of a christening gown, a necklace, and a folded letter, barely legible but unmistakably in Sarah's handwriting. It began as the other had, "To the child I may never hold," and it ended, this time with a name Emily had traced back to her own family tree, a name that would undo the neat narrative the town had preserved for decades. Jessica stood in the gathering hush, her thoughts quiet but pointed. Sarah hadn't vanished. She had been buried, deliberately, symbolically, and just a few feet beneath the pageantry that had tried to replace her. Jessica sat later that evening by the inn's hearth, the fire unlit, her notebook open before her. The letter lay beside it, its edges now pressed beneath glass for protection. The pieces, at last, had aligned. Sarah Ames had never left Milford Hollow. On the day she was to be crowned May Queen, she had confided in someone, perhaps in Thomas Ridley, perhaps in Dorothy, perhaps in Ivy herself, that she was pregnant, that the child's father had abandoned her, that she would be forced to raise the baby alone. For Sarah, it was an act of honesty, but for others, it was a threat to everything the festival symbolized: purity, tradition, control. Jessica believed the confrontation had grown heated, and whether by accident or panic or something more, Sarah had died. It had been easier, for those involved, to make her disappear. Her name had been erased from the festival records, her belongings boxed, buried. Her daughter passed into another household, and the maypole, erected with fresh flowers each year, became both a monument and a cover. Jessica's pen hovered over her notebook. What Emily had uncovered wasn't just her ancestry, it was the rupture in a carefully maintained illusion, a truth too deep, too inconvenient to allow, and someone had silenced her before she could finish telling it. Jessica walked alone the next morning, her steps leading her toward the edge of the square where Ivy Creel's home stood, orderly, precise, austere in its symmetry. The curtains were drawn. She remembered Ivy's face at the festival, the clip tones, the quick dismissals, and the way her voice caught, just slightly, when Sarah's name was mentioned. Jessica didn't need a confession to see the shape of it. Ivy had seen Sarah's pregnancy as a defiance, not of morality, but of structure, of how things were done in Milford Hollow. She had feared the disruption, not the girl. And now, decades later, Emily had reopened the wound. To preserve the image, Ivy had acted again, using knowledge of the garden's flower, of the vial's effects, of the town's blind trust in her control. It hadn't been rage, it had been doctrine. Jessica paused near the monument, the faded ribbon still tied to its rail. The past had not stayed buried. It had bloomed, however briefly, in the life of a girl who simply wanted to know where she came from, and it would bloom again, because the truth, once rooted, had a way of growing back. Jessica stood by the gazebo as the townspeople began to gather, drawn more by quiet obligation than festive habit. The air carried the soft chill of early dusk, and though the green was dressed in pale streamers and wreaths of white mayflowers, there was no music. No children wove ribbons this time, no laughter rose from the booths. At Jessica's gentle urging, the town had agreed to hold a small memorial for Emily, a modest gesture cloaked in tradition. But beneath the surface, she had arranged something more, a reckoning wrapped in remembrance. Dorothy stood beside her with folded hands. Thomas Ridley arrived late, his face set in grief that was harder to read than to feel. Ivy Creel, ever composed, took her place near the front, with her usual poise, though her eyes did not linger long on the wreath that now hung where the May Queen's crown should have rested. Jessica glanced over the gathered faces, the mayor, the committee, the townspeople who had been silent too long. This was not a trial. It was something quieter, more exacting. The final page of a long unspoken story. She stepped forward, her voice steady. We gather here not only to remember a young woman lost too soon, but to listen to what she saw, what she sought, and what she might have uncovered had she lived a little longer. There was a murmur in the crowd. Ivy looked down. Jessica continued. In Emily's final days, she walked the same paths Sarah Ames walked nearly 50 years ago. She followed the questions no one dared to ask. She found fragments of flowers, of letters, of silence. The wind shifted gently through the trees. Jessica paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces. She did not invent a mystery, she uncovered one. Jessica reached into her satchel and removed the envelope, aged, sealed, then reopened by grief and persistence. She held it without flourish, allowing the weight of its presence to fill the silence. This letter, she said, was written by Sarah Ames on the morning of the 1975 May Day Festival. It was meant for the child she would never raise, a child who was, as we now know, placed with another family and raised without the truth of her mother's death. She opened the flap and drew out the photograph, Sarah holding her newborn, a shawl wrapped tight around both of them. She handed it quietly to Dorothy, who passed it down the line. In that same year, Jessica continued, a landscape expense was recorded in the festival budget. For work done on the green, the week Sarah disappeared, she turned to Sheriff Murtaugh, who stood stiffly beside the gazebo's railing. That same week, Ivy Creel's signature appears twice, once on a committee approval form, and once on the authorization for soil work beneath the new maypole base. Ivy's eyes rose to meet Jessica's, calm but hard. Jessica went on. Emily followed Sarah's path. She found the garden where a rare flower grew. Jacob's Bain, a plant with mild toxicity, harmless to the skin but dangerous if concentrated. A flower found on Emily's collar, in a vial beside her body, and crushed beneath Daniel Kerr's bed, conveniently planted. There was a ripple in the crowd. Ivy remained still. She didn't mean to expose scandal, only to understand where she came from. But what she discovered touched something deeper, a fear of disruption, of shame, the kind that sees silence as survival. Jessica took a breath, her tone steady now, and for the second time in Milford Hollow, a young woman was silenced to preserve an image. The air was thick now. Ivy's hands, folded so tightly over her handbag, had begun to tremble. Jessica looked not at her, but past her, to the townspeople who had allowed the illusion to stand, to those who had not asked or had looked away. But no illusion can last forever, she said quietly, especially not one built on soil already seeded with memory. The crowd had grown dense around the square, the lingering chill of dusk folding over the assembled townsfolk like a shroud. Ivy Creel stood apart, poised but visibly unsettled. Her usual composure wavered as Jessica's words hung in the air, quiet, deliberate and impossible to refute. Jessica's gaze met Ivy's, steady and unwavering. Ivy, it's time to speak honestly. The evidence you cannot deny. The letter, the photographs, the soil work authorized under your name, the same soil that concealed a truth this town has ignored for far too long. A faint tremor passed through Ivy's hands, folded tightly at her waist. Her eyes flickered to the ribbon Jessica held, worn, frayed, a symbol of two young lives entwined in secrets. I was young, Ivy began, voice brittle with decades of unspoken weight. Sarah, she was reckless. She challenged everything we believed in. Her pregnancy was a scandal, not just for her, but for all of Milford Hollow. I was tasked with protecting tradition, with protecting the festival, our town's heart. Her breath hitched. We argued. I tried to warn her to keep quiet, to save what was left of her reputation, but she was stubborn. She threatened to expose everything. Jessica watched closely as Ivy's hands clenched and unclenched. It happened in the heat of the moment. I didn't mean to kill her. We struggled near the maypole. She fell, hit her head on a rock. She was gone before I realized. A tear traced down Ivy's cheek, startling in its suddenness. We buried her. Together with Thomas, we thought if we kept silent, the town could go on free of shame. She turned, voice harder now. Then Emily arrived, reopening old wounds. I panicked. I never wanted her harmed. Jessica said softly, but someone needed to stop her. You say it wasn't you? Ivy hesitated, eyes flickering toward the crowd. I don't know who else it could have been. A long silence stretched between them, charged, fragile. Jessica nodded. Your confession is just the beginning. There are more truths to uncover. But this is a start. The sheriff stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, his voice calm but firm. Ivy Creel, you are under arrest for the death of Sarah Ames and for your involvement in the events leading to Emily Ridley's death. The townspeople murmured in disbelief, faces pale beneath the dimming sky. Ivy's shoulders sagged as she allowed herself to be led away, hands trembling as she was gently guided through the crowd. Jessica watched quietly, feeling the weight of decades settle over the square like a long-held breath finally released. Faces reflected relief, sorrow, and the complex mixture of guilt and hope. Dorothy stood near Jessica, her eyes wet. It's over, isn't it? Jessica shook her head gently. No, Dorothy, it's only just beginning. The truth had been silent too long. The reckoning would take time, patience, and courage. But for now, a veil had lifted, and Milford Hollow could finally breathe. The morning sun cast soft light over Milford Hollow as the townspeople gathered quietly near the old churchyard. The air was cool but steady, filled with the faint scent of freshly turned earth and blooming lilac. Beneath a sprawling weeping willow, two simple white markers stood side by side, one for Sarah Ames, the other for Emily Ridley. Families, friends and strangers alike, circled the graves, heads bowed in respectful silence. The long shadows of old secrets had at last begun to lift, replaced by a fragile hope. Jessica stood just behind Dorothy and Thomas Ridley. The mayor's shoulders were less rigid now, the tightness around his eyes softening as he whispered a prayer. Dorothy's face was a quiet testament to both sorrow and relief, a woman who had borne the burden of truth alone for far too long. Daniel Kerr approached the front, invited by the family to speak. His voice trembled slightly, but he steadied it as he addressed the crowd. Emily believed in this town, he said, not just its traditions but its people. She wanted us to see ourselves clearly, with all our flaws, and to heal. Jessica watched the faces around her, worn but attentive. The years of silence and fear had fractured them, but here in this moment, they seemed to mend. It was not a joyous day, but it was an honest one, and sometimes, honesty was the first step toward peace. Days later, the town square held a meeting unlike any in recent memory. Dorothy stood at the podium, a steady flame in the soft glow of afternoon light. Milford Hollow's May Day festival has always been about community and renewal, she said, her voice clear. But renewal requires truth. She announced her intention to take up the role of May Day organizer, promising that future celebrations would honor not only tradition but also the stories long buried beneath it. Jessica listened as Dorothy spoke of transparency, of records to be made accessible, and of a festival that could embrace both joy and history. Daniel, too, was publicly cleared of all suspicion in Emily's death, his name restored. There was cautious applause. Jessica felt a quiet satisfaction, not just for justice, but for the courage to face uncomfortable truths. That evening, Jessica returned once more to the war memorial, now softened by twilight and fresh blossoms. She settled onto a nearby bench, notebook open but untouched. Her thoughts drifted to the nature of silence, how it could protect, but also suffocate. In Milford Hollow, silence had been a shield for generations, concealing pain and shame beneath layers of ceremony and smiles. Yet silence had also been a cage, trapping the innocent and the curious alike. Jessica fingered the faded blue ribbon she had carried since her first day in the village. It was fragile but resilient, like the truth itself. Her mind traced the journey from a withered bouquet behind the monument, through whispered secrets and hidden letters, to the reckoning that now echoed through the town. She understood, as she always did, that justice was rarely swift. It was patient, deliberate, and born from a community willing to face itself. As stars began to blink into existence overhead, Jessica penned a final note. Truth is the flower that never fades, even in the darkest soil. She closed the book gently, feeling the weight of the day, and the lightness that came with having borne witness. Before leaving Milford Hollow, Jessica made one final pilgrimage to the monument. The night was calm, the breeze gentle. She knelt and untied the frayed blue ribbon from her satchel, feeling its rough texture between her fingers. With care, she tied it to the wrought iron fence that bordered the square, a quiet tribute to Sarah, to Emily, and to the resilience of those who had sought the truth. The ribbon fluttered softly in the wind, a symbol of remembrance and the long-awaited justice now rooted deep in the town's heart. Jessica stood slowly, breathing in the crisp night air. She knew the past would never fully release its hold on Milford Hollow, but neither would its hope. With one last look, she turned away, her heart at peace, her mind already carrying the next story waiting to be told. Truth has a way of blooming quietly, even in the darkest soil, reminding us that what is hidden can never stay buried forever. But what shadows linger still, just beyond the light of what we think we know? I wonder how often do we choose silence over truth, and at what cost? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I'm eager to hear your reflections. If this story stirred your curiosity, please like, share with fellow mystery lovers, and subscribe for more tales that unfold gently in the quiet corners of human nature. Until next time, keep listening closely. There's always more beneath the surface.